My son bought me a ticket on a cross-country bus, sat me in a vinyl seat, and whispered to the driver, "Drop her off at the last stop, make sure she stays there." He thought he had gotten rid of me forever, but as my son walked away, the driver looked into my eyes and froze. He recognized me. It was him, the boy whose life I had saved 50 years ago. When the bus pulled out of the station, he took my hand and whispered, "Don't worry, Mrs. Gable. The last stop isn't on my route today." Hello, my dear listeners. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Please write in the comments and tell me which country you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you. Now enjoy the story. The hum of the bus terminal vibrated through the soles of my shoes, a low, anxious thrum. It was a mixture of smells: diesel fumes, stale coffee, and something else, something sweet and unsettling, like the air before a thunderstorm. I held onto my son's arm, and his elbow felt alien under my hand, hard and unyielding as stone. "Now, Mom, what's with the long face?" David's voice was deliberately cheerful, almost boisterous. "This is a surprise. A real vacation. You've done so much for me and Sarah all that time with the grandkids. You've earned a break at a wonderful retirement community. Fresh air, activities, peace and quiet." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the scuffed, weary-looking bus waiting at the gate. A wonderful community apparently necessitated a journey in a cramped, aging coach on an overnight route, rather than a ticket on a comfortable daytime flight. There was a sense of haste to it all, a frantic rush that didn't align with the idea of thoughtful care. It felt less like they were sending me on a holiday, and more like they were expediting my removal. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in my chest. It had formed earlier that morning when Sarah, my daughter-in-law, had kissed me goodbye on the cheek but had failed to meet my eyes. Her gaze had darted around the room, landing on the wall, on my suitcase, anywhere but on my face. She seemed afraid I might read something in her eyes, something I wasn't meant to know. And now this hurried scene at the terminal, this cheap, grim bus. "Here we are, Mom. Your seat is by the window, just how you like it." David heaved my single, surprisingly light suitcase onto the overhead rack. I had barely packed anything. "They have everything there, Mom, don't take anything extra," Sarah had insisted. I sank onto the stiff seat, the vinyl cool and cracked against my legs. The bus smelled of stale air freshener and something faintly sour. My son lingered for a moment, adjusting the curtain on the window, pulling at the thin, gray blanket. His attentiveness was so false, so theatrical, that it only made the ache in my heart more acute. He was playing the role of a loving son, and it seemed he desperately wanted to believe in his own performance. "All right, Mom, I should go, or it'll leave without me. You rest up, get your strength back. I'll call you when you get there." He hugged me, a brief, tight embrace. I could feel the tension in his back. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was tearing himself away. Then he turned and walked quickly down the aisle without a backward glance. I was alone. The silence was broken only by the low rumble of the bus terminal outside. I pressed my forehead against the cool, slightly grimy glass and watched him go. He didn't walk towards the exit. He walked alongside the bus, his eyes scanning for someone. There he was, the driver. A man in a company jacket, his face weary and weathered. My son approached him. I watched transfixed. I saw David speaking quickly, insistently. I saw his hand slip into his pocket, then press a wad of crumpled bills into the driver's palm. The driver frowned at first, seemed to want to refuse, but my son said something else. He was standing half-turned towards me, and I, a former librarian accustomed to quiet observation and attention to detail, more so read his lips than heard him through the thick glass and the noise. "Drop her off at the last stop. Make sure she stays there." He said it. My son. My boy, whom I had rocked in my arms, for whom I had baked pies and saved pennies from my pension for gifts. The one for whose new summer house I had, without a second thought, sold my parents' apartment, my only real nest. The world didn't collapse. The sky didn't split open. No scream erupted from within me. On the contrary, it suddenly became very quiet. The entire terminal's noise, all the voices, all the announcements, It all receded as if behind a thick glass wall. And through my veins, starting from my very heart, a coldness began to creep slowly, very slowly. It wasn't pain. It was clarity. A terrible, absolute, crystalline clarity. As if a veil I had lived behind for decades had been lifted, and for the first time I saw everything as it was. Not a son, but a weak, greedy man. Not a well-deserved rest, but a betrayal. David turned and walked away. This time quickly, almost running. He never once looked back. He knew I was watching, and he was afraid to meet my gaze. The bus lurched once, twice, and then slowly began to move, carrying me away from the platform, from the city, from my entire past life. I didn't cry. I just sat up straight, staring out the darkening window, and felt the ice inside me turn to steel. The door to the driver's compartment creaked open, and the driver himself stepped into the aisle. He was a man in his late 60s, tall, gray-haired, with deep lines etched around his eyes. He wasn't looking at tickets. He was looking directly at me. His gaze was long, searching. It held none of the greed or indifference I had expected to see. It held recognition. He walked slowly down the aisle. His face, so tired on the platform, suddenly changed. The lines around his eyes seemed to soften, and in the depths of his eyes, a shadow of something long forgotten, almost impossible, flickered. Disbelief. Shock. He stopped a few feet from me, and the silence on the bus became so thick you could almost touch it. Helen. His voice was quiet, raspy, but he said the name as no one had said it in 50 years. Not Eleanor, not Mrs. Gable, but Helen. My maiden name, my childhood call sign. Something inside me trembled. The steel rod that had just been forged from ice vibrated like a string. I looked closely at his face, at those gray eyes the color of a stormy sea, at the line of his mouth. A memory buried under a half-century layer of life broke through to the surface with such force that it took my breath away. Arthur? It's me, Arthur, he whispered, as if he had read my thoughts. He stepped forward and gently, almost reverently, took my hand. His palm was wide, warm, and calloused. The touch was a ghost from a life I thought was forever buried under the ruins of time. He's gone, Arthur said, his voice now firm, confident. He nodded towards the window, where the city suburbs were already rushing by. You're not going to any last stop. My route ends in Chicago. My daughter lives there. She's a lawyer. Come with me, Helen. Let's write a different ending to our story. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not pity. I saw a past that had suddenly become the present. I saw a chance not for revenge, no, for something more. For justice. For the chance to reclaim myself. And I, who a moment ago had been an old woman cast aside, felt a calm, resolute strength spread through my body. I squeezed his warm hand a little tighter. It was my answer. My first step off the bus that was supposed to be my prison. My first step towards a new life. He squeezed my hand in return, a silent, unbreakable pact. Then he quietly slid the door to my small seating area closed, cutting us off from the dim corridor light and the shuffling steps of the few other passengers. We were alone, two ghosts in a small world hurtling through the darkness, with 50 years of silence hanging in the air between us. He brought 2 paper cups of hot black tea from a thermos. The aroma filled the small space. The rhythmic clatter of the bus on the highway was steady, lulling. He didn't rush me. He just sat opposite me and watched, and in his gaze was such a mixture of bitterness, tenderness, and old pain that I knew he too had remembered all these years. They transferred my father, he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was even, without drama, like a man who had replayed these words in his head 1,000 times. You remember, he was in the Air Force. The orders came suddenly. We had 48 hours to pack. I didn't even have time to say a proper goodbye. I left a note for you, tucked it into the fence post. Then I wrote every week for almost a year. But you never answered a single letter. I decided you'd met someone else, that you'd forgotten me. So I stopped. The wheels of the bus kept a steady rhythm. Never answered. But I had never received a single letter, not one word. Inside, where the steel rod had been, something pricked painfully. But I pushed the feeling away. Now was not the time for old hurts. Now was the time for the truth. And I began to speak. The words flowed surprisingly easily without tears or self-pity. My voice was calm, as if I were reading a report on someone else's life. About how I had married, how David was born, how I had dedicated my entire life to him, denying myself the small things so that he could have the big ones. How I sold the 3-bedroom brownstone in the city, my parents' nest, full of books and memories, so my son and his wife could buy a summer house in the Hamptons. Not just a house, a palace, a place where they would be happy. That's what they said. I told him how I moved in with them into their city apartment, becoming an unpaid nanny, cook, and housekeeper. How Sarah would purse her lips in distaste if I happened to sit in the living room to watch television. Mom, you should rest in your room. You've been on your feet all day. My room, a former walk-in closet, 6 by 8 feet with no window. I told him how they took almost my entire pension for the household expenses. How my grandchildren, picking up on their parents' attitude, started calling me Grandma Helen who helps us, as if I were a servant, not a relative. Arthur listened in silence, not interrupting. Only his fingers slowly clenched into a fist on the small table, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not pity but fury. A fury on my behalf, the kind I had never allowed myself to feel. When I finished, the sky outside was already beginning to lighten. A gray, damp dawn was breaking over the passing forests and fields. They didn't just kick you out, Helen, he said quietly. They've been erasing you piece by piece for years, hoping you wouldn't notice. In the morning, when the bus, with a screech of brakes, pulled into the Chicago terminal, I was met not only by the damp city air but also by a young woman, tall and poised, with the same straight posture as Arthur and his gray, but businesslike, sharp eyes. Mrs. Gable, hello. I'm Kate. She held out her hand. Her handshake was firm, confident. My father told me everything. Let's go to our place, have some coffee, and you can rest a bit. Her apartment overlooking the lake was bright and minimalist. Nothing superfluous. An order that was calming, not oppressive. While Arthur busied himself in the kitchen, Kate sat opposite me with a laptop. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She listened to my condensed retelling of the overnight conversation with her father, and her face grew more and more serious. Okay, she said when I fell silent. The first thing we're going to do right now is establish your whereabouts so they can't report you as a missing person or worse, as suffering from dementia. We'll go to the nearest police station, and you'll write a simple, formal statement. I, Helen Gable, am in Chicago visiting friends. I ask not to be disturbed. This is our first move on the chessboard. At the police station, I felt strangely calm. The young officer took my statement with a bored expression, but under the stern gaze of Kate, who had presented her lawyer's ID, he became much more focused. I wrote in a steady, clear hand. Every letter was an act of self-respect. I was no longer a nameless old woman who could be dropped off at a nameless last stop. I had a name and I was asserting my right to it. Returning to the apartment, for the first time in many years I felt safe. Arthur wrapped me in a blanket. Kate worked at her computer. Her fingers flew silently over the keyboard. She was searching databases, checking addresses, property records. I dozed off to this quiet tapping, and I didn't dream of buses or my daughter-in-law's cold eyes. I woke up to a profound silence in the room. The sound of the keys had stopped. I opened my eyes. Kate was sitting motionless, staring at the screen. Arthur stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. The evening sun streamed through the window, and in its rays I saw Kate's face. It was pale and hard as stone. She slowly turned to us. The phone buzzed, shrill and demanding. It was my old device, which had been silent all this time. The screen lit up. David. Don't answer. Kate's voice was quiet but firm as steel. She waited until the call stopped, and only then did she speak. I checked the documents for the summer house. Yes, it was bought with the money from the sale of your apartment. That's easy to prove. But that's not the issue. The issue is that 3 weeks ago, a mortgage was taken out against that house. She paused, choosing her words. A very large mortgage, several $100,000. Since you were the primary investor in the property purchase, by law, your notarized consent was required to secure the loan. She looked me straight in the eye. Her gaze didn't waver. That consent exists in the bank's documents. With your signature. Except the signature is a crude, obvious forgery. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked at Kate, at her serious, focused face, and felt how the cold that had been born in me at the station was transforming from ice into something else, into a hard, smooth, cold metal. It was no longer grief, no longer hurt. It was understanding. The understanding that the line between family cruelty and a criminal offense had been crossed. My son and his wife were not just ungrateful children. They were fraudsters. Fraud on a grand scale, Kate said my thought aloud. Her voice was even emotionless, like a surgeon delivering a diagnosis. A serious felony. I'll start preparing the documents. We'll need a handwriting expert, but that's a formality. The main thing is to prove intent. She turned back to the computer, and I leaned back on the sofa. In my surprisingly clear mind, an image surfaced. Not David's face, not Sarah's smirk, but a room. The room on the second floor of their summer house, which they proudly called the library. When I agreed to sell my apartment, I had made one single condition, that a separate, dry, and bright room would be allocated for my late husband's books. Paul, my husband, had collected them all his life. It wasn't just a collection, it was his quiet passion. First editions of classics, rare collections of poets, books with autographs that he hunted for in flea markets and second-hand bookshops. He wasn't a rich man, but he had a nose for it. He could spot a treasure under a dusty, unassuming cover. After his death, these books became my anchor, a connection to our shared past. Each one smelled different. Leather, old paper, dried flowers that I sometimes placed between the pages. When I was moving, I had packed each book myself in thick paper. I had personally supervised the movers as they carried the boxes into this library, and I had arranged them myself on the new lacquered shelves. I had a catalog, a simple school notebook where years ago, helping my husband, I had entered every book. Author, title, year of publication, special features. A tooled leather binding, yellowed pages, a dedicatory inscription on the flyleaf. That notebook, where was it? I had left it in my room in that closet. It should be in the dresser drawer with my documents. Kate, I called out quietly. She tore herself away from the screen. Arthur, who had been standing nearby all this time, came and sat next to me. His presence was silent and solid like an old tree. My books, I said. My husband's collection. They are there at the summer house. I can make a list from memory. The most valuable ones. Kate's gaze became sharp as a needle. She understood me without extra words. Which ones exactly? A first edition of The Great Gatsby. A signed copy of a Robert Frost collection. A first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. I listed them and Kate typed quickly, opening websites of antique stores, online auctions, and collectors' forums in her browser. There was no hope in this, but rather a grim necessity to check one more darkest suspicion. If they had gone as far as forging a signature for a loan, what could stop them from selling off someone else's property? And then my phone buzzed on the table again. The vibration was insistent, angry. David. He had called for the 5th time that evening. After my statement to the police, they must have realized that I wasn't freezing in a snowdrift somewhere, that their plan had gone wrong. I looked at the screen, at that familiar name that had become so monstrously alien. A part of me, that old motherly part, wanted to grab the phone and scream into it. How could you? But the other new, cold and strong part simply observed. Don't, Kate said, not looking up from the monitor. Let him call. Let him get nervous. Let him make mistakes. We must remain silent for now. Silence is our main weapon. The call ended. A minute later, a message arrived. Mom, where are you? We're going crazy with worry. Please call. Worry. What a carefully chosen, deceitful word. I imagine them sitting in their cozy apartment now, Sarah biting her nails and hissing at her husband, and David, pale, sweaty, pacing from corner to corner, not knowing what to fear more, exposure or his wife's anger. I didn't answer. I just watched as Kate methodically scanned page after page. Arthur brought me more tea. His hand briefly touched my shoulder. This simple gesture said more than any words of support. He was here. He was with me. The past that I thought was lost turned out to be my only true ally. An hour passed, maybe more. Outside the window, the blue Chicago twilight thickened. Kate worked mostly in silence, only occasionally muttering under her breath when another website proved useless. And then she froze. "Found it," she said so quietly I could barely hear. She turned the laptop screen towards me. It was the website of a private dealer, one of those who work not for the general public, but for serious collectors who value confidentiality. On the page of recent sales there were photographs. There it was, my Gatsby. The worn spine, the familiar small stain on the cover. And below it, the frost. And below that, the Harper Lee. All sold within the last month. I looked at these small digital images, and I didn't even have the strength to breathe. They hadn't just taken out a loan. They hadn't just wanted to get rid of me. They had methodically, coldly, and calculatingly destroyed the last material traces of my life, of my memory. They were cutting out my past like a tumor, selling it off piece by piece. Who was the seller? Arthur asked, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. The seller acted through an intermediary, of course, Kate replied, pointing to a line in the lot description. But in the private part of the transaction, which I have access to through professional channels, the owner who provided the goods for commission is listed. Sarah Gable. Sarah. Not David, who might have been afraid or ashamed, but her. Businesslike, practical, for whom my husband's books were not a memory, but just a stack of old paper that could be profitably turned into money. At that moment I realized they considered me already dead. An old woman written off, whose voice meant nothing, whose treasures could be plundered in broad daylight. They thought they were sending a voiceless victim on her final journey. They just didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that on that bus to nowhere, I would meet my past and my future. I slowly reached out and closed the laptop lid. The soft click sounded in the quiet room like a verdict. Not for them. For me. A verdict on my past life, on my illusions. Now it was all over. Now we have proof not only of fraud but of theft, Kate said calmly, but a cold fire burned in her eyes. This aggravates their guilt many times over. We will gather everything and strike once. But surely. The next few days turned into a strange, drawn-out wait. Kate worked, drafting inquiries, collecting documents, preparing a lawsuit. She was like a general planning a decisive battle. Arthur surrounded me with a silent but so tangible care. We walked along the Chicago River. He showed me his favorite courtyard buildings, told me about his life, about his wife who had died several years ago, about his work, about his daughter, of whom he was immensely proud. I barely spoke. I absorbed this city, this peace, this new reality where I was seen, heard, and respected. Meanwhile, my phone, lying on the dresser in the hallway, had turned into an instrument of torture. Realizing that I was not answering their panicked calls, David and Sarah changed tactics. They launched an attack on another front. The first to call was my cousin from Florida. Her voice on the answering machine trembled with tears. "Helen, what happened?" David called, crying into the phone. "He says you've been having some trouble, that you left home and disappeared. We are so worried about you. Please get in touch, dear." Then my old friend with whom I had worked at the library. "Helen, it's Tamara. Your daughter-in-law Sarah called me. She said you have memory lapses, that you could be anywhere. Oh God, Helen, if you hear this, find a police officer, ask for help. We are all looking for you." And so on, one after another. Distant relatives, old neighbors from my sold apartment, acquaintances called. The scenario was the same. David and Sarah were calling everyone whose phone number they could find and putting on a heart-wrenching performance. Grief-stricken children whose elderly mother, alas, had lost her mind and disappeared in an unknown direction. I sat on the sofa in Kate's living room, and Arthur would put the calls on speaker, and we would listen to these messages. Every word was like a whiplash. They didn't just want to rob me. They wanted to destroy my identity, my good name that I had built my whole life. They were turning me into a crazy old woman in the eyes of everyone who knew me. They were taking away not only my money and books. They were taking away my past, my reputation, my human dignity. It hurt. It didn't hurt for David. I no longer felt pain for him. I only felt bitterness like from a spoiled product. It hurt for myself. For the Helen Gable who was known and respected, who had been honest, responsible, decent all her life, and who was now being methodically, posthumously dragged through the mud. I have to call them. I burst out after another message full of tearful lamentations. I have to tell them the truth. Tell everyone. Absolutely not. Kate stopped me firmly. She came and sat opposite me. Do you understand what they're doing? They're creating an alibi for themselves. They're preparing public opinion. If you start calling now and screaming about fraud, who will they believe? The grief-stricken children or the senile mother who is spouting nonsense? They will use any emotional outburst against you. They will say, see, we told you, aggression, inadequate behavior. These are all symptoms of her illness. We must keep a cool head. Patience, Helen, just patience. I knew she was right, but it was unbearable to sit and listen to yourself being buried alive. Arthur saw my state. In the evening, he simply took my hand and led me outside. We walked for a long time through the quiet streets, and he talked about the stars, about ships, about something simple and eternal. He didn't console me. He was just there, and his calmness was transmitted to me, extinguishing the inner fire, leaving only a cold, hard determination. I will endure. I will wait. And then a call came that changed everything. The number was familiar. Anna, my old neighbor. We had lived on the same floor for 30 years. She was an unsentimental, practical woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye. I thought I was about to hear another portion of sympathy mixed with reproach. But Anna's voice on the answering machine was completely different, not alarmed, but rather conspiratorial. Helen, it's me, Anna. I don't know where you are or what's happened to you. And I don't believe your son's nonsense about your head. I know you better than they do. So listen carefully. I was at my country house and our plots are right next to that palace your kids built for themselves. I saw your Sarah 2 days ago. She wasn't weeding the beds. She was showing the house to some slick guy in a suit, a realtor 100%. I was walking by, pretending to look for mushrooms, and I overheard snippets of conversation. Anna's voice dropped to a whisper. She was telling him about a quick cash sale and something about immigrating to Spain. Her husband was offered an excellent job. So, Helen, I don't know what they've been telling you, but it looks like your kids are planning to skip town. You be careful. Something's not right here. The message ended. Arthur, Kate, and I looked at each other. A deafening silence hung in the room, and in that silence, all the scattered pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into a single ugly picture. The sale of my apartment, the purchase of the summer house, the forged signature, the multi-million-dollar loan, the sale of the books, the performance with my insanity, and now the urgent sale of the house. The scheme was horrifyingly simple and cynical. They take out a loan against the house. They sell the house itself for cash. And they disappear with 2 sums of money in their hands, the loan and the proceeds from the sale. They fly off to their Spain, and the bank, not receiving the loan payments, comes to collect the collateral. An empty house that no longer belongs to them. And me? What about me? I'm a crazy old woman who got lost somewhere. No one will look for me. They didn't just want to get rid of me. They wanted to pull off a scam, leaving behind a scorched earth. And I was just an annoying obstacle that needed to be removed from the stage in advance. I stood up and went to the window. Down below, people were hurrying about their business, lights were on, ordinary life was flowing. And I, up here, was looking into the abyss that my own son had dug for me. And I no longer felt fear or pain. Only a cold, calm realization. It was time to end this show. I slowly turned from the window. My gaze met Kate's. There was no longer sympathy in her eyes. There was steel. Now we have everything, she said quietly, but every word was weighty as a stone. Motive, intent, method of commission, attempt to cover tracks and flee. This isn't just fraud. This is a criminal group acting in concert. The following days took on a clear and distinct rhythm. There was no more drawn-out waiting. There was work. Kate turned into a bundle of energy and will. She found the notary whose signature was on the documents. He was a portly, middle-aged man with shifty eyes. At first, when Kate went to his office disguised as a client, he behaved arrogantly and aggressively, denying everything. The woman was there, she showed her passport. What am I, a forensic expert? To verify signatures? Everything was legal. But Kate was ready. She didn't threaten or accuse. She just calmly, point by point, laid out the printouts on his desk. The list of books sold at auction, information about the realtor showing the summer house, data that 2 non-refundable tickets to Malaga for the following week had been purchased in Sarah Gable's name. You see, Mr. Thompson, Kate said in her even almost gentle voice, right now you are a witness. But if it turns out you were in collusion, you will become an accomplice, and that means a completely different sentence. And losing your license will be the least of your worries. My client, whom you supposedly saw on that day, was 1,000 miles from your office, and we have irrefutable proof of that. Kate told me about this in the evening, and I saw how the notary's face changed as she spoke. At first, it was purple with anger. Then it turned gray with fear. He started to stammer and then he broke. He admitted that there had been no woman. There was only Sarah. She came with a poorly forged power of attorney and a thick envelope of cash. She fawned, said her mother-in-law was very ill, couldn't walk, and there was no way to bring her to the office. He pretended to believe her. Money doesn't smell. He certified the forged consent without even looking at the signature. The notary's confession, recorded by Kate on a dictaphone, became the missing link that turned our case from a difficult one into an absolutely irrefutable one. My task was different. I had to restore my own paper trail. I sat at Kate's desk, and in front of me was a stack of documents that Arthur had helped me request from my old bank. Here it was, the statement. A clear, merciless line. A transfer of a large sum from my account to the account of the summer house seller. Direct proof of where the money for their palace came from. Then I turned to the photographs. From my small bag, I took out a few old photo albums that I had grabbed on some intuition. It was all I had left of my past life. I leafed through them, looking for pictures of my old apartment. Here is the living room, and on the wall, an antique clock in a wooden case. A gift from my grandfather. Here is the bedroom, and on the dresser, silver candlesticks, my mother's dowry. I circled these items in the photos, and Kate made notes. All these things, which, like the books I had moved to the summer house for safekeeping, were now physical evidence. Each photograph was another nail in the coffin of their lies. Arthur sat next to me. He didn't interfere, just silently sorted through the old pictures I had set aside. His presence was a quiet harbor in this ocean of betrayal. It was he who found them. In the oldest, most tattered album with a velvet cover, something was bulging between the back cardboard and the last page. Arthur carefully pried up the edge with his fingernail and pulled out a stack of yellowed envelopes. They were letters. Each one had a postmark from half a century ago. The return address was a field post office number, and in the to field was my name, Helen. And on each envelope, a blue stamp from the post office. Return to sender, addressee not found. I looked at these letters, at Arthur's neat, slightly slanted handwriting, and my breath caught. 50 years. They had been lying in this album for 50 years, a few centimeters away from me. 50 years of silence that I thought was caused by his forgetting, was actually a wall that someone had built between us. I looked up at Arthur. He was looking at the letters, and his face was like a mask carved from stone. All the pain of that time, all his bewilderment and resentment were reflected in his gaze. But that wasn't all. Under the stack of his letters was another envelope, newer, without stamps or postmarks. It wasn't sealed. I pulled out a sheet of paper folded in 4 from a school notebook. The handwriting was painfully familiar. My late husband Paul's clumsy masculine script. The letter was dated a year before his death. He was already very ill then. Apparently, He wrote it during one of those sleepless nights when the past comes and demands an answer. My dearest Helen, I read to myself, the words blurring before my eyes. If you are reading this, it means I am already gone. And I must confess one sin to you that has tormented me all my life. When we were first married, letters came for you from him, from that pilot. I saw how you waited for the mailman. I saw how sad you were. I was so afraid of losing you, afraid that you would compare me, a simple engineer, with him, a hero. And I took them from the mailbox. I didn't read them, just hid them. I thought you would be sad for a while and then forget. Forgive me if you can. I loved you as best I could. Foolishly, selfishly, but I loved you. I read to the end and slowly lowered the sheet. The silence in the room became absolute. It was a second betrayal. Not as cynical and cruel as my son's. It was different, quiet, cowardly, dictated by fear and insecurity. But it had also changed my life. It had stolen 50 years of possible friendship from me, of the possible knowledge that somewhere there was a person who remembered me. It had made me believe that I had been forgotten. I looked at Arthur. He looked at me. And at that moment, all the pain of the past, all the resentments, all the unspoken things, it all washed away. All that was left was a pure, piercing understanding. We had both been victims of someone else's lies, someone else's fear. Our lives had gone down different paths, not by our own will. This discovery didn't break me. On the contrary, it gave me strength. My fight with David and Sarah was no longer just about retribution for stolen money. It became a fight for the right to the life that had been taken from me. For the right to a future where there would be no room for lies. Neither new nor old. I carefully folded my husband's letter, Arthur's letters, and placed them on the stack of documents. This too was evidence, not for the court but for myself. I stood up, walked over to Kate, and placed my palm over her hand, which was resting on the computer mouse. She looked up at me. "It's time," I said. And she nodded. The plan was simple and ruthless, like a surgical instrument. The next day, Kate, armed with all the collected evidence, did not go to the police. She went straight to the bank, to the fraud department. She didn't ask or threaten. She simply laid a folder on the desk of the head of security. It contained everything: a copy of the notary's statement, the preliminary conclusion of the handwriting expert about the forgery of my signature, printouts from the auction, data on the tickets to Spain, and as the cherry on top, the testimony of the realtor confirming the intention of an urgent sale. Kate explained the situation to them as clearly as possible. The bank was on the verge of losing several $100,000. They could try to collect the debt from the fraudsters who were about to flee the country, or they could cooperate, help restore justice, and get their money back by annulling the fraudulent transaction. The bank employees, cynical people accustomed to thinking in terms of profit and loss, reacted instantly. The prospect of losing such a sum and being at the center of a scandal with forged documents did not please them at all. They immediately agreed to full cooperation. The trap was set. The bank called Sarah. In an official, cold tone, she was informed that a small technical discrepancy related to the transfer of funds had been found in the loan documents. And to resolve it, the personal presence of both borrowers was required. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. At the summer house, to verify all the property documents on site, the bank clerk kindly explained. It was the perfect pretext. They couldn't refuse. Not showing up for a meeting with the bank would mean arousing suspicion and possibly accelerating the blocking of their accounts. They had to come. They had to play the role of respectable clients to the very end. The day before the meeting, I spent with Arthur. We didn't talk about what was to come, we just walked. He took me to the river, and we sat for a long time on the granite embankment, watching the dark Chicago water flow slowly. The sun was low golden. It painted the spires and roofs in warm, soothing colors. I looked at the water, at the boats passing by, at the gulls circling overhead, and for the first time in many, many years, I felt an absolute peace. Not the silence of despair, not the resignation of a victim, but peace. A deep, conscious calm of a person who knows they are doing the right thing. I had no gloating or thirst for revenge. Those feelings had burned out, leaving behind only a pure, cold determination to see it through to the end. I was no longer a chip of wood carried by the current of someone else's will. I had become the one who directs that current. I was not a victim reacting to their moves, but the architect of their downfall. Are you afraid? Arthur asked quietly, looking at my profile. I turned to him and shook my head. No. I used to be afraid. Afraid of their displeasure, of their sidelong glances, of their cold tone. Afraid of being left alone. And now I know that I was already alone all these years. Now I am not alone. I looked at his hand, lying next to mine on the warm granite. I didn't touch it, but I knew it was there, and that was enough. We returned to Kate's apartment in the evening. She met us in silence with only a short nod. Everything was ready. The next day was scheduled down to the minute. And it was at that moment, in this silence before the storm, that my phone, forgotten on the dresser, came to life again. It didn't ring. It just beeped briefly, signaling a new voice message from David. I walked over to the phone. Something told me that this was the last message, that this was the end. I put it on speaker. At first, there was silence, then the sound of an exhale, a suppressed sob, and his voice poured out. But it wasn't the anxious tone of a caring son. It was a drunken, rambling monologue full of self-pity. Mother, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want? Do you think it was easy for us? Do you think we didn't deserve it? This summer house, this house was our right, our inheritance. You lived for yourself your whole life, only thinking about your books. And we had to slave away for you. His words were slurred. He was clearly not sober. But a drunken tongue spoke what a sober mind was silent about. We just took what would have been ours anyway. Took it earlier. Before you would have spent it all on yourself, on your ailments, on your whims. You owed us, do you hear? For the whole life we were forced to live with you. For everything. He fell silent, breathing heavily into the phone. And then there was a click. The message ended. A dead silence hung in the room. Arthur slowly rose. His face was dark as a thundercloud. Kate didn't move, but I saw the knuckles of her fingers gripping a pen turn white. And I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Emptiness. As if he were not talking about me. As if he were accusing someone else, a stranger. There was no truth in his words. There was only an ugly, selfish attempt to justify his own baseness by shifting the blame onto the victim. You owed us. This phrase became the final nail. Not in my coffin, but in theirs. Kate silently walked over, took my phone, connected it to her laptop, and in a few seconds copied the audio file. This, she said quietly and distinctly, is a full confession, direct proof of motive. Tomorrow they won't have a single chance. She was right. This wasn't just a drunken confession. It was their verdict, which they had passed on themselves. She saved the file to her desktop and named it simply Verdict. Then she turned off the computer and looked at us. I'm going with you tomorrow, I said. It was not a question but a statement. The next day we drove to the summer house. I sat in the back seat of Kate's car, next to Arthur. I looked out the window at the passing suburban landscapes, but I didn't see them. I only saw the house. It was exactly as they had described it, large, two-story with huge windows and a ridiculous turret. It was built with my money, on the ashes of my old apartment, on my memories. It was a monument to their greed. We stopped at the gate. A little further away, a respectable black car was already parked. The bank representatives. Kate got out first. Arthur opened the door for me and gave me his hand. I straightened my back, squared my shoulders. I was wearing a simple but severe dark dress that we had bought the day before. I was not a decrepit old woman who had been thrown out into the cold. I was a person who had come to take back what was hers. We went inside. In the huge living room, furnished with screamingly tasteless luxury, they were already sitting at a massive oak table. David and Sarah, and two men in expensive suits. Their faces. It was a whole gamut of emotions that changed in a few seconds. First, annoyance. They were clearly not happy about our appearance, considering us unnecessary witnesses to their business meeting. Then bewilderment. What was I doing here? Where had I come from? And then when I stepped forward, emerging from behind Kate's back, pure unadulterated horror was reflected on their faces. The very horror that a criminal feels when caught in the act. David froze like a pillar of salt. His face turned an earthy gray. His lips parted but made no sound. He just stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the end. Sarah recovered first. She had always been more spirited. Panic flashed across her face, but it was immediately replaced by an insolent, aggressive mask. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Her voice rang out in the silence. "We agreed you would be at the sanatorium. Did you get confused again? Gentlemen, please forgive us." She addressed the bankers. "My mother-in-law has age-related problems. She sometimes doesn't understand where she is." She was trying to play the same show as on the phone, but here face to face her lie looked pathetic and unconvincing. "Hello," Kate said in an even voice, walking around the table and sitting opposite them. She placed a thin folder on the polished surface of the table. "I am Kate Petrova, an attorney. I represent the interests of my client, Mrs. Helen Gable, and we are here to discuss not a technical discrepancy, but a case of fraud on a particularly large scale." The bank representatives exchanged glances. They were in the know. They were part of this performance. Sarah snorted. "What fraud? Young lady, what are you talking about? This is a family matter. Mom is just tired, she needs to rest." But Kate wasn't listening to her. She calmly, methodically, without a single extra emotion, began to lay out the facts. She talked about the sale of my apartment, the transfer of money, the purchase of this house. And then she took the first document out of the folder. "Here is the notarized consent to receive a loan with Mrs. Helen Gable's signature. Here is the conclusion of the handwriting expert, proving that the signature is a forgery." Sarah's face began to lose its insolent flush. Kate took out the next sheet. "Here is the statement of the notary, Mr. Igor Thompson, who confessed to taking a bribe and certifying a forged document in the absence of my client." David sank into his chair. He seemed to have shrunk in stature. "Here is a list of unique antique books belonging to Mrs. Helen Gable. And here are the statements from the auction and the testimony of the dealer, confirming that these books were sold by you, Mrs. Sarah Gable, within the last month." Sarah jumped up. "This is a lie. Slander. I'll sue you." "And here," Kate continued, not raising her voice, "is the testimony of the realtor to whom you, Mrs. Sarah Gable, showed this house 2 days ago, discussing an urgent cash sale and your husband's immigration to Spain. The tickets, by the way, have also been purchased." Kate paused. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. "And finally," she said, "to clarify the motives for your actions." She took out my phone, connected a small portable speaker to it, and pressed a button. The drunken, hate-filled, self-pitying voice of my son filled the room. "This summer house was our right, our inheritance. We just took what would have been ours anyway. You owed us, do you hear? For the whole life we were forced to live with you." When the last phrase faded, David covered his face with his hands and whimpered, a low, childish sound. He was broken, destroyed. And at that moment Sarah realized that the game was over, that the ship was sinking, and like a rat, she rushed to save herself. "It was all him," she screamed, her voice breaking into a shriek. She pointed a finger at her sobbing husband. "It was his idea from the very beginning." She tore open the zipper on her expensive designer bag, which she had been clutching like a lifebuoy. She pulled out a thick folder and slammed it on the table. I knew it would end like this. Here is everything. Printouts of all his emails, how he persuaded me, how he planned all this. I told him it was wrong, that it was vile, but he wouldn't listen. He kept saying that you wouldn't understand anything anyway, that you were old and stupid. I'm not going to sit in prison for his greed. She looked at him with such fierce hatred, with such contempt, that for a moment I was scared. All their love, their family, their union, built on the common goal of robbing me, had crumbled to dust in an instant. They were devouring each other before my eyes. This was the end, not just of their plan. It was the end of their life together, of their pathetic, rotten-to-the-core union. All the gilding had come off, and underneath there was only emptiness, cowardice, and mutual betrayal. I looked at them, at the crying, weak man I once called my son, and at this predatory, frightened woman, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not gloating, only a cold, immense fatigue and a detached, almost medical curiosity. Were these really the people for whom I had sacrificed my life? I raised my hand, calling for silence, and strangely enough, they fell silent. Even Sarah, choking on her accusations, fell silent and stared at me. "Enough," I said. My voice was calm and firm. I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to the bank representatives, to Kate, to this whole house. I want this loan agreement to be annulled as fraudulent. I want the ownership of this house, bought with my money, to be restored to me. And I want these people, I slowly looked first at Sarah, then at David, to be held accountable by law for everything. What followed happened quickly and somehow detachedly, as if I were watching a movie. The bank representatives, having received everything they needed, evidence and confessions, hastily retreated, assuring Kate of their full cooperation. And 20 minutes later, there was a polite but insistent knock on the door. It was a police squad, which Kate had called in advance. David and Sarah were let out one by one. Sarah did not resist. She walked with a stone face, looking straight ahead. It seemed she was already calculating in her mind how she would testify against her husband to save herself. And David? He looked up at me as he passed. There was no hatred in his eyes, only devastation and a kind of childish, bewildered grief, as if he still didn't understand how his beautiful plan could have collapsed so completely. At that moment I felt one last thing for him. Not love, not anger, but a quiet, boundless pity for this weak man who had never managed to grow up. When the door closed behind them, the house became very quiet. I was left standing in the middle of the huge living room. Arthur and Kate stood silently at the entrance, giving me time. I slowly surveyed the room. The vulgar velvet sofas, the gilded frames on the walls, the crystal chandelier the size of a small tree. It was all alien, dead. This house was not my legacy. It was a tumor grown on lies and betrayal. And I looked at it not with a sense of loss, but with the clarity of a surgeon who sees that the tumor has been removed and recovery is ahead. "Sell everything," I said to Kate without turning around. "This house, the furniture. Everything down to the last trinket. I don't need anything from here. I didn't want to live in a mausoleum built on the bones of my past life. The money from the sale would not be compensation for my suffering. It would be the foundation for my future, for my new beginning." A few months passed. The legal procedures took their course. The trial of David and Sarah was still ahead, but its outcome was a foregone conclusion. They had drowned each other in their testimonies, and their fate no longer interested me. The house was sold. The money was in my new bank account. I felt strangely and unusually light. And now I am standing on a station platform again. The same hum, the same smell of iron and distant roads. But everything was different. The air was different. Not the stuffy summer air, but the fresh autumn air. The station was different, not my native provincial one, but the majestic Grand Central in New York. And I was different. I was holding a man's arm again, but his elbow was not alien and stone-like, but familiar and reliable. I was standing arm in arm with Arthur. Our train was already at the platform. Not an old shabby train, but a new gleaming Acela Express. We were not traveling in a cramped compartment. A spacious, cozy sleeper car with 2 soft berths and a table by the window awaited us. We had bought the tickets ourselves. With our own money. We were going south to the sea. Just because we wanted to, because we could. Arthur helped me up the steps, carried our small suitcases. The compartment smelled of cleanliness and something subtly festive. He closed the door behind us, and we were alone in our little world, ready to set off. I sat by the window and looked at him. He sat opposite me. In his eyes, still as gray as a stormy sky, there was no longer any old pain. There was a quiet, calm tenderness. He reached his hand across the table and took mine. His palm was as warm and calloused as it had been on that first evening on the bus. But now there was no ice or steel in my chest. There was only a steady, deep warmth, the feeling of home, not the kind made of bricks and mortar, but the kind you find in another person. The train started moving smoothly. I looked out the window at the passing platform lights, at the people waving goodbye. But this time I wasn't looking for anyone who wouldn't turn back. My gaze was fixed forward. I didn't know what lay ahead for us. Maybe a year, maybe 10, or maybe just this one autumn by the sea. It didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, I was traveling not away from something but towards something. Not into exile but towards a new dawn. The train picked up speed, carrying us away from the city that had become my salvation, towards a new unknown chapter. My liberation was complete. I had reclaimed not money or a house. I had reclaimed myself. And that was the only inheritance that mattered. Thank you for being with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and write in the comments what feelings it evoked in you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Be healthy, value yourself, and live truly.